There's a couple times that you've referred to like sort of the centralization of the generative models as either Iris or I would say definitely active inference generative models apply to this as well. That, they're sort of run by one set of people. One thing that, we haven't gotten a chance to talk about, and we'll probably have to talk about more in a future conversation, is the notion of how do you decentralize the compressions of the knowledge that is integrated by those models into, some sort of distributed data store. Because I've always viewed it more as that there would be many, many different irises. People often ask me why there isn't just one. And I mean, I think you know exactly why there shouldn't be just one. And that there would be some energy-bound distributed data store that is taking these compressed tensors or compressed representations of knowledge as they are evaluated by or used by many different models and stored in a secured way that many future models can build their representations from. I view it more like there is a DNA strand that is the collective cultural ethos and world observations, and that these models are more like the molecules that do the correction when there is the replication of a DNA strand. And that ultimately is sort of the model that, even you and I have not gotten much work into and really needs to develop, is that there needs to be sort of an evolution or a merging of these blockchain structures or just distributed data stores and the knowledge in its very dense form into that, beyond just, like saving a copy of it, something more fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, that like literally, so the conversation I mentioned earlier that I had yesterday, like that exact idea, that was something that I was speaking with Jordan and Steph about when we were discussing, especially the role of something like blockchains, the role of something like Bitcoin, when it comes to, and not Bitcoin specifically, but proof of work, having something that is highly resilient that ends up being a kind of centralized repository for highly compressed encodings that can represent as a kind of DNA over the space of emergent systems that have models, right? Because DNA itself was the way in which, like you're saying, these molecular mechanisms and all of the emergent structure above them in its exploration of function space created a feedback process that compressed down into molecular space representations of what works that can then be unpacked again and experimented with into function space. Right? That's this DNA function, right? But that was all in the being a model world. But in the having a model world, we have to actually, because all of this becomes explicit, we have to become sufficiently self-aware that we actually create or steward the creation of a similar kind of, and this is weird because there's this duality here. If you did it on a blockchain, like something like a Bitcoin, you want it to be capture resistant. So it could be highly centralized, but because it's capture resistant, that centralization actually can become a tool that increases the capacity for decentralized coordination. Because if every decentralized system can contribute to it and take away from it to some extent, then they can all focus on it, their attention on it without having to necessarily be tightly coupled with it, except when they want to contribute to it or decode from it, right? Because the decoding can always happen for free. The encoding comes with a cost if you want to inscribe. Yeah. But to the extent that anyone can benefit from decoding, like think about like what would happen if an advanced model were basically leaked and its weights were put onto the blockchain. Right. Like now, this may or may not be desirable at this point. Like we might argue that we need a better container for that before it actually makes sense or could be advantageous, and that leaking a powerful model and making it irreversibly accessible on something like a blockchain with respect to its weights or a compressed version of its weights or a program that could generate those weights if that was a valid compression. It's unclear whether that's desirable or not desirable right now. But my point is that these kind of mechanisms are almost with 100% certainty going to be the kind of places where we encode these highly compressed distillations of our collective experimentation over this space of computation, AI, and also complex coordination via systems such as the entire other world of like proof of stake and exploration of distributed governance, decentralized economics, all of that kind of that space where we're seeing a massive amount of experimentation right now. We're seeing a lot of failure. We're seeing a lot of parasitism. We're seeing a lot of craziness, but we're also seeing the seeds of potentially interesting or useful patterns. To the extent that much like mutations, to the extent that those come into the world and actually provide value, how do you re-encode them into a space where anyone can then replicate those patterns in the world, right? So if a particular DAO finds a set of configurations and weights over their mechanisms that actually gives rise to really positive capacity for a group to collaborate, coordinate, and be generative as opposed to parasitic or extractive, that's a kind of pattern that should be encoded and shared, right? Yeah. And it should be accessible with very low cost, if not free, in something like a blockchain that cannot be easily captured or corrupted for local interests of any other entity on Earth. So, yeah, I mean, I think exactly like the degree to which something like an iris is centralized or decentralized. It's an interesting question because to some extent it's a question of adoption and evolution and how all these different threads of that system come into usage locally, right? I mean, obviously you want to spread it far and wide and have those sort of seeds cast upon the winds of potential throughout human interest and experimentation, such that they land and take root and grow in fertile soil. Obviously, because we're humans, people will try to use it for abuse as well, and all these other things that we do. But yeah, I mean, I really do see it as this recapitulation of this natural process at the level of having models as opposed to being models, and we are trying to figure out how to what it looks like to create the kind of social mechanism that is the analog of DNA, right?
Yeah. And there, I would add, just in summary, to try to link it all back together, that there definitely needs to be, this could very easily go wrong, where it's trending towards reducing that uncertainty in our knowledge representations, right? I've already seen over like 2 years with GPT, first, there was a very wide space where you could explore the long tail. You could talk about things that aren't well established, and more it's like there's a regulation into this is the way things are, and because they are controlling when that update happens, it's harder and harder to do research to that. So whatever compression goes into that distributed data store, it needs to have that preference towards the exploration of the uncertainty, like you were speaking of, to variational free energy versus, what was it?
Expected free energy.
Expected free energy. Like there needs to be a tendency not in our compression of knowledge to say, well, this represents truth in its totality, and rather this is a representation that is inherently mutating and changing over time, and something that is existing to expand our capacity over time to exist and thrive, where our neural mechanisms of encoding memory, of encoding models, are just a little bit too lossy for long-term.
Yeah. And then there's like kind of like sedimentary dynamic there as well, where to some extent, the longer that certain aspects of that model have remained stable, the more they kind of migrate down to a more, a deeper and more stable structure. That doesn't mean that layer can't be changed.
Yes,
it does. It does get more difficult to change. The more
energetic constraints on that. Yeah.
Yeah. The more that you have energetic constraints, the more that you have dependencies, the more that you have a history of the world being congruent with that representation, it does get more difficult to change as it migrates down that stack. But But the understanding is that the entire stack, all the sedimentary layers, even though proportional to their level, they will be like the top layers will be more volatile proportionally than the bottom layers, but they are all subject to change if you have a observations or empirical experiences of sufficient surprise, right?
Yeah.
And we and that reflects what we are like as well, right? Like we have we can be shocked to such an extent that our entire world models, it is revealed to us that our entire world models down to their core need to be recalibrated if we encounter experiences that are sufficiently outside of our model. Although, unfortunately, we increasingly are leaning into the tendency to lean into confirmation bias and to try to say, I'm going to ignore the signals the world is giving to me. I'm going to try to force my model on the world. Again, it's like there's always a certain element of interplay between like whether it's beneficial to try to like put your model onto the world or allow the world to transform your model. But it always has to be in dialogue, and it becomes inherently totalitarian when you decide that no matter what, I'm not going to change my model and I'm going to push all of the responsibility for transformation out onto the world as opposed to taking any of that in your own model.